Is philosophy class unconscious? Welcome everybody to the next installment of our mini-series on professional philosophy and its myths. To think about this question, we have with us today Dr. Heather Stewart, who is an assistant professor of philosophy at Oklahoma State University. She specializes in feminist philosophy, political philosophy, digital ethics, as well as bioethics. And she is also the co-author of a couple of articles on the relationship between philosophy and class. These are articles that she has co-authored with Ariana Falbo, who is currently at Toronto Metropolitan University. And so, Heather, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming. So we drew upon your work in our book, Professional Philosophy and Its Myths. But the work we drew upon was the APA newsletter on feminism that you co-authored with Dr. Falbo. And so your new article is called Outsiders Within, Reflections on Being a First-Generation and or Low-Income Philosopher. And I just wanted to start off by asking you, what are some of the unique challenges that students from low socioeconomic backgrounds face in academic philosophy? And one thing I wanted to note is both David and I do come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, so feel free to answer this both from your article, from your own personal experience, like however you want to take this question.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. And thank you for sharing that as well. Both Ariana, who David mentioned, I've co-authored some of these, both the newsletter that you mentioned and another article on class in philosophy. Ariana Falbo and I, we both also come from low socioeconomic status backgrounds. We're both first generation college students turned professors. So issues of kind of how class intersects with the practice of philosophy, the profession of philosophy are really kind of near and dear to our hearts. So Ariana and I have been thinking about this question for a few years. So some of the things that we've kind of thought about together in terms of how low-income students face certain hurdles in philosophy. So kind of the most obvious one, right, is that low-income students face a number of financial and material barriers when it comes to attending college and university. And certainly to attending graduate school. So, I mean, we all presumably work in universities. We know, right, that the cost of tuition and the cost of attendance more generally is exorbitantly high and rising, right? So there's that kind of barrier. Connected to that barrier, right, there's issues of predatory student loans with high interest rates, a changing federal landscape that makes those student loans more difficult to pay back, right, and the risk of taking them out much higher. Often low-income students don't have the same access to resources, maybe family resources to draw on for things like living expenses associated with attending college. Kind of related to that, right? Low-income students are more likely to have to work while attending college, and this results in certain kinds of trade-offs, right? If I have to work one or more part-time jobs while I'm a, college student, then that takes away time that I might otherwise be spending on my studies, and that's kind of a disadvantage relative to peers who may not have to work while attending college because they have the benefit of having certain kinds of family resources to draw on. So I think some of those early on in college financial hurdles can be demotivating in a lot of ways, right? I remember being in university and having to work various and sometimes multiple part-time jobs, right? Barnes and Noble here, working in the tutoring center there, getting hours wherever I can fit them between my course schedule and my studies. And a lot of my fellow students didn't have to do that, right? And so it was easier for them to attend study sessions and these kinds of things. And that can be really demoralizing, right? And I think those challenges get even worse as we look to graduate school. And in graduate school, it's sort of assumed that grad students are spending the vast majority of their time on their studies, on their TA duties, on various kinds of research. And so if you have students who have to find ways to access income outside of that, right, it's easy for them to fall behind and relative to their peers in their cohort, and also to find that really demoralizing. So I think some of the challenges that kind of start in undergrad, if we're thinking about people in the pipeline into the profession, those things get even more challenging as we get to graduate school, with its notoriously small graduate stipends that grad students are sort of expected to live on. So those are some of the sort of material and financial barriers. Ariana and I have also spent a lot of time thinking about some of the kind of psychological barriers that low-income students and first-gen students might experience. There are a number of these that we could talk about. Some of the things that kind of stand out to me and my experience are just the way one feels completely alienated by the extremely weird culture and norms of academia that are totally unfamiliar to someone who was raised in a sort of low-income or working poor environment. And right, that academia and its weird norms are totally unfamiliar to your family, and right, it makes it difficult to talk about what's going on in academia. So we talk a lot about some of those like psychological barriers and hurdles too. Yeah, I'll stop rambling, but
no, you're not rambling at all. So just to follow up, I mean, is there anything specific to philosophy? So you mentioned the like pipeline problem, the issues first gen students face. And is there anything specifically about the discipline of philosophy versus, say, either other humanistic disciplines or maybe even grad students for STEM, although STEM tends to earn more money because they're more closely tied to industry, they tend to be better funded, but that's a separate question. But I mean, is there something about like philosophy, academic philosophy specifically and its norms, or something about the field itself that you think is particularly inhospitable to students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds or first generation students?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the kind of specific culture and norms of philosophy in particular, right, you can think about how philosophy is thought of, and this might not be true. I mean, we might not think this might not be how we practice philosophy, but this idea of philosophy as being this like hyper abstract kind of like luxury thing that you get to do if you have lots of time and money, right? I think about, so when I was in university, I was a pre-med biology major that accidentally fell in love with philosophy. And I remember having the conversation with my parents that like, I think I'm going to ditch this whole med school idea and pursue philosophy. And the idea being like, well, that's not going to make any money, right? So I think there's this like pressure on students, especially from low income backgrounds or for whom attending college or university is really not something that was necessarily expected or given, but is something that's kind of just unexpected for them in a variety of ways. I think the study of philosophy then leads to all these questions from people around them, their families, their communities of like, why do that? If you're going to spend all this time and money going to college, you should go into a STEM field or something like that. And I think within philosophy, right, there, I don't want to beat up too much on the discipline or the folks within it, but you can think about kind of the culture as often being kind of elitist, right? I mean, we've all been to professional conferences where everybody's dressed really nice. They happen in these hoity-toity, extremely expensive hotels. You're expected to go to these extremely expensive dinners. And all of those things can be really foreign and alienating to students. I remember being an undergrad and being invited to a professor's home for the first time. And that was lovely, and it was a great experience for me as an undergrad, but it was also deeply terrifying, right? I was in the kind of home that I never could have imagined being in, even for a visit, relative to the kinds of homes I saw growing up. And then, of course, there's this fancy dinner with all kinds of silverware I don't know what to do with, right? And so, like, there's this kind of almost like elite kind of class built into just what you're supposed to be able to do and navigate within even just the social parts of being a professional philosopher or even a philosophy student. So I think some of that is maybe really specific to philosophy in some ways.
Yeah, no, I mean, when I think about my trajectory through the discipline, there are so many moments where I was reminded of my class background. Mm-hmm. And, I can't even say that it was other people who thought about it as much as I became aware of the fact that I didn't feel like I belonged in those literal spaces. So, for example, I remember it was one of my first weeks when first year graduate student, newly minted, pursuing a PhD. Somebody asked me in my department, another peer, whether I was more interested in German or French philosophy, and I responded that I was more interested in French philosophy. And then they asked me, oh, what's your favorite French city? And I thought to myself, you guys have been to France? You've been to Europe? I don't know how to answer this. And I felt shame because I didn't know that I could say I've never been there, because then what does that tell other people about my relationship to French thought, to French philosophy, to philosophy more generally. And also, you mentioned the parties. Mm-hmm. One of the first times that I went to a professor's fancy dinners, I was expected to comment on the food, on the wine. People were talking about the qualities of the wine, and that already is so class coded.
Yes.
But it's also extremely invisible to those who are in the know. They don't even realize how that's affecting others. Now, I want to ask you a question that keeps the same theme going that Rebecca brought up about what's specifically happening with philosophy and its relationship to class, such that maybe it is class unconscious. Because one of the things that you point out in the article that came out earlier this year is that there is so little data, empirical data, about the status of class in professional philosophy. So if you look, for example, at the American Philosophical Association, they have been tracking demographics about gender, about race, about even about philosophical beliefs, like how many realists are there in the discipline, how many constructivists are there in the discipline. But there is very, very little data on class, so that if you want to know, well, what's really the class composition of this academic discipline, you almost have to enter that discussion from the side. You need to look at other things, like, you mentioned university is expensive, predatory loans, all these other things, to try to get at the question. My question for you is, why do you think philosophy has been so uninterested in tracking its own class standing?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and one that Ariana and I have kind of grappled with, because when we've written on this, we've really, we've tried to look for the data to kind of bolster some of our just kind of intuitions about class in the profession. And like you said, the data is just not there. As you mentioned, I think this is still true. It was at least true when we were working on that article, that the APA is not tracking socioeconomic status or first-gen status as part of their kind of collection of demographic data. And so that makes you wonder, right? Like, maybe it is this just kind of implicit assumption that people that do philosophy do come from a certain kind of class standing. I hope that my friends at the APA aren't just making that assumption, right? So maybe it's something else, right? Maybe it's, I don't know. Maybe it's a question of values. Maybe it's thinking that class just isn't all that important, right? So maybe some people think like experiences of race are extremely important for how one progresses through the discipline. Experiences of race certainly are significant to how one progresses throughout the discipline. But maybe there's just this assumption that class isn't really all that relevant. So I know at one point when Ariana and I were working on some of this stuff, someone made a comment that like, well, I was low income and I didn't feel like it impacted my trajectory through the discipline, which of course is wonderful, right? But probably not reflective of a lot of people's experiences of class. So maybe that is part of it, right? That there's just this assumption that these other markers of identity, like class and, like race and gender and so on, really impact one's experience or trajectory, and class doesn't. And maybe there's issues with sort of reporting. So you mentioned going to your first kind of dinner and feeling this kind of shame when someone asks you the question about your favorite French cities. Maybe that's part of the challenge too, right? Like, are people really going to disclose what their sort of economic situation is to this body, this professional body that represents this discipline that does have a lot of elite norms and assumptions, right? Maybe that kind of shame makes it such that people wouldn't so easily self-identify as being low income. I'm not sure, right? That's all just speculative, but it does seem like in order for us to try to make some inroads on making things better for philosophers and students from low income backgrounds, we have to start doing better at breaking down those assumptions and really trying to track that data so we can show like there are people in the profession who come from these backgrounds and who want to enter the profession from these backgrounds, and so here they are, and here are things that we can do to try to help make their experience easier.
Yeah, I mean, going off what you said, I think also like part of the difficulty is like how you define class, perhaps. So I was just thinking about this when I was reading your article, which is, you could, when we talk about these sorts of markers that we associate with the notion of class, it kind of presupposes a kind of unitary idea of class that may not exactly track with how people understand their own experiences or their own positionalities. For example, I can easily imagine, David and I both come from like low income backgrounds, but I can imagine somebody whose, parents may own a very successful small business, who might be very practical and very affluent in material terms, but who might be uncomfortable with, some of the, deal with the, oh, that's not going to make you money question, right? So, like, how do you exactly pinpoint this? Somebody who who's the child of immigrants is going to have a different experience from, somebody who, I'm from a New England family who are poor. That's very different, right? So when we talk about the term class, it, I think is a little bit broad here, and how it informs how somebody moves in. Obviously, there are material realities that we can all relate to, people expecting you to be able to go to a conference across the country, and then, as you point out in your article very well, get reimbursed later when, I didn't have a credit card until very late. So I think that might, in part, I do think it is exactly what you're talking about, which is people who have these kinds of more academic parents or more affluent parents who are tied into the world of academia are not maybe aware of this and maybe not tracking it. It's not visible, it's not brought up. But I think it also is partially the phenomenon in the term class that I think is problematic here.
Yeah, and we've run into this challenge too with even how we kind of want to operationalize first generation as well, right? So when we put out a call for submissions for the special issue on first generation experiences in philosophy, we received emails from people being like, neither of my parents have a PhD, right? Do I count as first gen? Or am I first gen if neither of my parents are professors of philosophy, right? And so, yeah, there are even ways of kind of making sense of who counts within this kind of category of a first generation college student or something like that. So I think, yeah, all those kind of challenges with defining class, defining first generation status, who kind of fits within those categories, which of course are kind of blurry and messy and need to be contextualized anyway. But yeah, so that probably also is a hurdle for trying to get good data on who these kind of issues most likely apply to.
Yeah, and I'm wondering also how easy it would be to get that data, even if the political will was there, because there are some issues that complicate that, right? So you mentioned that most graduate students live paycheck to paycheck. That might include people who come from wealthier backgrounds. And I'm also thinking here about people who come from wealthier backgrounds, but maybe have a break with their family for whatever reason. How do you understand their class position? Because at one point, Rebecca and I toyed, and I really mean that, we toyed with the idea of conducting a survey at the APA for tracking some of this information. Neither of us is a sociologist, so we quickly realized that we're not the right people to do this. But what questions do you ask people? Is it about your income? Well, all graduate students would be low income by that standard. Where do you draw the line between low income and lower middle class? How do you differentiate between economic and cultural dimensions of class? It's really difficult, but nonetheless, despite those difficulties, it does seem very clear that philosophy is a magnet for what I would describe as middle and upper middle class subjects. But interestingly, this is something that I believe we mentioned in passing in our book, it really isn't an attractor for the upper echelons, like the really, really wealthy people, much like potentially those people who think philosophy is not going to make you any money. If you're a really wealthy person, you also don't want your kid to be a philosopher because you want them to take over the hedge fund, the family hedge fund. And so it's interesting that the class positionality of philosophy seems to be in the middle to high, but it really excludes the really, really high and most of the working class. I'm just curious about whether you have thoughts about that, either about the exclusion of the high end, specifically about that.
Yeah, that's that's really fascinating and not something that I've thought about, but it does. I mean, your explanation of that seems spot on, right? That for the very upper kind of income bracket, that the same kind of concerns you see at the lower end, like, you know, philosophy is this impractical kind of thing that isn't gonna, you know, grow the family income substantially or something like that. Even if you're successful in philosophy, you're not making what, you know, a CEO is making. Sorry if like any grad students see this and that crushes their dreams or anything, right? But yeah, so maybe some of those kind of like parental concerns and the way that parents might shape what their children, their students want to study in college, like maybe some of those concerns kind of run parallel to each other, right? The philosophy is not something that is extremely practical, not something that's going to make you wealthy or wealthier. So I think that's really fascinating. I wasn't really aware. I mean, yeah, who knows? Because this data is often lacking. But yeah, that's fascinating that you see the same kind of trends at the very upper income.
And I saw that while teaching at an elite institution like Emory, where you have a lot of kids who are the children of the 1%, fall in love with philosophy, and their concern was, my parents don't want me to do this because I'm supposed to be a finance major or a business major, or I need to be a doctor. And so it was the same pressure, but coming from a very different end. Right. In some cases, really leading to students feeling like they either had to break with their passion or make a real break with the family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's a whole conversation to be had about, you know, elite universities as functionally like reproducing certain forms of certain class formations, and that maybe being pretty fundamental to what a university education is. But that's bringing us way out of bounds for the conversation today. But actually, that does remind me. I wanted to ask you, you know, the sort of so what question. So, philosophy descriptively, and again, it's hard to back it up with data. I mean, I think David and I, when we were doing the book, we looked at PhDs generally tend to come from other PhDs, and we kind of extrapolated about philosophy a little bit from there. But yeah, there's not a lot of data, but assuming that we're correct in our assessment that philosophy at its upper echelons tends to, be composed of people from certain academic or like upper middle class backgrounds, like what would, being more inviting, being more inclusive, what would that mean for philosophy? What could people who are not from your sort of standard issue, my parents a lawyer, my parents a professor, I'm interested in philosophy and I have the leisure and the money to pursue it, what would people bring, to first gen and lower income people bring to philosophy itself, rather than just being a principle of fairness where we want to make it more equal? How could they transform philosophy?
Yeah, this is a great question and something Ariana and I have thought about, because I mean, it's easy to point to, all of the negative things, like all of the barriers and the hurdles, both sort of material and psychic, that first gen and low income students might experience. But thinking about why does it matter that we make it such that these students can be in these spaces, I think is a really important question. So we talk about some of these in the more recent article. One thing I think, so I see this a lot at Oklahoma State University because I have a lot of first gen students who are working while attending college. Often they're working in, they're working on their parents' farms and things like that, right? So they bring a real clash of kind of norms and cultures and experiences from what's standard in academia, which I think is important for professors to bump up against, especially if they don't come from that kind of background. But that often brings a different sense of what counts as hard work, right? So for a lot of their peers who do come from higher class backgrounds, their sense of hard work might be, I studied for 4 hours last night or something. And for some of our first gen low income students, their sense of hard work is, I woke up at 4 o'clock this morning and I worked on the farm and then I made it to my 10 o'clock class or something like that, right? So I do think there's this real kind of sense of what hard work is, what it requires, that first gen and low income students can kind of bring into the conversation. Often these students really want the work that they do to be practical, to be applied, right? To be something they can take into their communities and do something with. So that kind of puts pressure on us, on instructors and faculty members, to make the work that we do, the teaching that we do, be relevant and be applied and be something that these students can do something with and show their families and communities the value of. And I also think our first gen and low income students are really good at bringing to light some of those kind of hidden assumptions about class that might otherwise just be taken for granted in our classrooms. So in the article, we give an example that someone gave to us at an APA session about teaching medical ethics at an elite, in this case, Ivy League institution, where most of the students just took for granted that like they could go to the doctor, right? That they could receive whatever healthcare they needed to receive, right? That money really wasn't an issue when it came to accessing healthcare. And there was a student in the room who talked about what it's like to be un or underinsured, right? And how that affects one's ability to access healthcare. And so the presence of that student with that very different lived experience kind of shifted that conversation about what we can assume about what it's like to access healthcare, how we make decisions about what healthcare we can or are going to access, and so on. So I think, too, just sometimes having the voice and the presence of a student whose lived experience doesn't look like a lot of the people's experiences that are represented in the room can really bring to light some of those assumptions, right? The assumption that everybody just has healthcare and access to healthcare, right? I've been thinking recently, I teach our ethics of AI class, and we do a bit about automation and the way that AI might reshape the workforce in various ways. And I think what some of the low income and working class students have to say about those issues are really interesting and important, right? Thinking about what jobs are most likely to be automated first, right? How they might affect the quality of life of people who are most economically vulnerable, those kinds of things. So I just think in general, like the presence of those kind of underrepresented lived experiences of lower economic status can really shed light on important things and highlight assumptions that might kind of be implicit in some of our in-class discussions, especially when it comes to things like healthcare and artificial intelligence and some of these really pressing issues that really intersect with class, but maybe not always in obvious ways.
Yeah, and I like the idea that there might be different views, for instance, about what work is and what counts as work, that then come into the discipline through this different perspective. At the same time, I think that can also lead to a particular form of alienation among people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds in philosophy, because philosophy is a form of cognitive labor. It's not manual labor. And I remember when I first was in philosophy professionally, I was having a discussion with my stepfather, who is a mechanic, blue collar, kind of like you work with your hands, you have lower back pain later in life as a sign that you had a dignified life experience as a worker. And we were having a beer one day, and he said, David, I really envy you. This was after I finished my PhD, because you managed to get a job now and you haven't worked a day in your life. And I was like, excuse me? Yeah. What do you mean? But I realized that, aside from the fact that I was, like, as we say in Spanish, burning my eyelashes with books, for my family, this didn't register as work at all, because it's not manual, it's not backbreaking. It registered as leisurely. And so they saw me as extremely intelligent, not because of my actual ideas, but because I managed to trick the system into getting a salaried position despite not having any manual skills. And it's something that I have felt myself also, because I do have that value of manual labor from my childhood and from my teenage years. And I also felt, I was just filled with guilt, apparently, class guilt, throughout my graduate program. But I felt like I was getting something that none of my family ever had, which is true. But I also didn't know how to think about it. And initially, I didn't think about it as work. I saw it as putting off work for a few years before I finally went back into the workplace.
Yeah, this is so relatable, because I've received similar, like in grad school, similar comments from family members, right? So while in grad school, and all things considered, I finished grad school fairly quickly, like relative to probably what's the norm. And still family members would be like, oh, you're still in school? Like, when do you get a real job, right? So there's not this understanding that grad school is a kind of labor, and you're working and you're receiving money, not much of it, right? But so they would ask things like, well, when do you start working? When do you get a real job? So even that, right? There's just often a lack of understanding about what graduate school is from family members and community members, and also just what academic jobs look like. Like, I find this all the time, that I'll share kind of aspects of my experience as a professor, as an academic, with my family members, and it's just not something they can kind of relate to. Like, you mean you've been writing a journal article for like 6 years? You know, like that kind of, like, and it is this kind of, there is this guilt associated with that, right? Like, how lucky am I that while, you know, my father and then my stepfather worked, you know, in factories, my brother has done a lot of hard physical labor. How lucky am I that I get to sit in an air-conditioned room and, you know, type away at my laptop and dive into books and do those kind of things. And that does come, yeah, with a certain kind of guilt associated with it. And you really see a lot of that come out in some of the first-person stories that are collected in that special issue that Ariana and I put together. A lot of students talk about that experience of just feeling like, you know, like, how lucky am I that I get to do this while the people I care most about are doing this kind of really hard physical labor, and maybe even receiving less financial compensation for doing that really hard physical labor.
Yeah, and it connects to the psychological barriers that you discussed earlier, because one thing that I really liked about your article is the split, the internal split that students from low economic backgrounds experience as they move, or as we move through professional philosophy. Because in order to really enter the field, we do have to acculturate. We do start imbibing some of the class norms. Sometimes our comportment changes, our way of speaking changes, our way of dressing changes. We start talking and looking the part. And that sense of inclusion and passing or becoming, you know, the distinction is really it's not the same as in relation to other identities. It is coupled with a sense of becoming increasingly distanced from one's own past, from one's own childhood, and from one's own family. Where, you know, you go back to visit your family and you realize there's a gap now in our references, in our sense of humor, in the things that we value, and even in how we see each other. I'm wondering whether you can say something about that, because I think that particular sense of change and becoming a person who no longer relates to their own class past is really important, and I think not unavoidable, but really difficult to avoid, given the elitism and the class structure of academia in general, but particular also philosophy, because its status as this queen of the sciences.
Right. Yeah. We talk about this as kind of like a double alienation, right? Like, you might never, if you come from a low-income background or someone for whom academia is really foreign and weird, even if you can do those things you described, right, start looking the part, dressing the part, talking the part, you may never really feel like, you know, you might always deal with that kind of imposter syndrome. You may never really feel like this is the world in which you are fully comfortable, you fully belong. At the same time, right, grad school and academia do change you in certain ways, and that may make it really difficult to step back into the worlds, the communities that you kind of came from. And right, so you're feeling kind of alienation on both fronts. One thing that I think is fascinating in some of the submissions we received for this special issue is people talking about almost having to adopt a sort of code switching, right? So like, and then this pool of like, who am I, right? Am I this person who can put on a blazer and go to the conference and use these big fancy words that I would never use when I'm on the phone with my mother, right? Like, am I that person, or am I this person that, you know, goes back to Kentucky and my Southern accent that I would never use at a philosophy conference starts coming back out and my y'alls start flying everywhere, right? That kind of thing. And so your ability to kind of like operate in both worlds partially, but never fully, right? And I think that can lead to some kind of internal tension for people, right? Like, I exist in academia, I exist in the profession, I can in some ways pass in those spaces, but they're not really like natural for me, right? I don't feel fully comfortable at home in them. But now I'm not really the person who left this other kind of background. I have history there, but I've changed so much, right? So I think, yeah, that can lead to this double alienation, this sense of like, I actually don't know who I am anymore because I'm not fully comfortable or at home or at ease in really either of these kinds of environments or spaces. So yeah, I think that can be draining for people. Frankly, I know I've experienced that, and I know a lot of the first person kind of stories we read really spoke to that experience.
Yeah, thank you so much for your answer. I do. I mean, I have kind of the opposite of imposter syndrome as a low-income person because when I was an undergraduate, I went to a liberal arts institution where everyone was extremely rich, and I kind of thought of them as just being there to pay my ticket because I was the one who actually was smart. But I realized I do not speak for every person who's low income. But yeah, so I have a question, which is, okay, so we have this, the things that we could potentially, bring to philosophy. How could philosophy become more hospitable to people who are from low income or first generation families?
Yeah, good. So kind of as we've been talking, I think some of the hurdles we've identified, like some of them cluster around the kind of the financial or material kinds of hurdles, other cluster around these kind of psychological hurdles or barriers, some of these cultural things. So I think there are ways of kind of tackling both. Ariana and I write about a number of these in the article, but I'll just kind of like hit on a few that come to mind. So in thinking about the first, like kind of financial or material hurdles, I think there are, I think departments often act like helpless when it comes to trying to alleviate some of the financial strains and pressures on students. And I don't think we're in fact helpless. I think we have some agency and some ability to make things better for students who need it. So thinking about some things we can do, right? So looking at my own department at Oklahoma State, some things we've implemented are, for example, fee waivers for graduate students who are applying to our master's program. So they don't have to give us some big narrative or prove, right, that they're low income. They just have to say, I need this, and they get a fee waiver for our program, right? That seems small, but that can make the difference between whether someone applies to our program or not. So I think things like fee waivers, right? Similarly for our, we have a terminal MA, and for our students who are applying out to PhD programs, we offer stipends to cover, I think last year we covered 5 PhD applications for each of our students who are applying to PhD programs. That's huge, right? If we think that, you need to apply to several programs to increase your chances of getting into a PhD program, but each application fee might be $75, $100, $150, right? Taking some of that burden off of the students. And these are choices, right? These are budgetary choices that we make at the department level. We only have a finite amount of resources, and they have, they're going to go somewhere else. And so maybe departments can make choices about, well, we're going to take a little bit away from faculty travel. Sorry, faculty. We're going to take a little bit away from having, extra cookies after the talk or something, and divert them to these resources that can really help our lower income students, and frankly, all of our students, get around some of these financial hurdles. So I think there are things like that we can do that can at least ease some of these difficult hurdles, whether for applying to grad school and so on. Relatedly, I think we need to do better at creating, or insofar as they exist, making students aware of basic needs supports that exist, like in our institutions. So things like food pantries, and trying to decrease the shame around making use of them where they exist. But I know here at Oklahoma State, right, we have food pantries that our undergrad and graduate students can make use of. Ariana told me that at her previous institution, they have something called a career closet, right? So faculty members can donate, for example, their shirts that they're not wearing anymore, and students can make use of those if they have job interviews or internships, or they're going to a conference and they can't afford, the clothes that might be required in that setting, right? So I think those are like, they seem small, but they can make a huge difference to if that student feels comfortable attending the conference or going to that job interview or whatever it is. So those are some kind of just small examples that might go a long way towards some of those financial hurdles. In terms of some of those kind of like psychological or cultural hurdles, one thing that I think can help is setting up kind of first-gen mentoring programs where first-gen faculty members are paired up with first-gen students and really help work with them in terms of trying to tackle some of that imposter syndrome, navigating things that their parents might not be able to help them with, right? Financial aid things, finding paid internships, these kind of things that our lower income and first-gen students might not know about or know how to find resources to help them access. And finally, something I think we can all do that can really go a long way with some of our first-gen and low-income students is just trying to like demystify some of the invisible norms and assumptions of academia, right? So helping our students know what office hours are, right? What do you do in office hours? Who can attend them, right? How should I talk to my professors, right? How should I engage them on email? Just some of these norms that might strike some of our students as obvious because they've been around these people or these environments for most of their lives, but for some students are completely not obvious, right? So just trying to illuminate some of those hidden assumptions, make academia less scary for students for whom it's not natural for them to be in the ivory tower, as it were. And yeah, I think those things can help at least ease some of those anxieties that our low-income and first-gen students might feel as they're entering into these spaces.
Yeah, well, as somebody who's teaching a lot of first years who are not necessarily low income, that's useful regardless of where you are. They need to, like, learning how to college is not exclusively difficult for people who come from low income backgrounds. But no. I think you're pointing out it is especially so. And I could talk to you about this all day. This is something that David and I have been thinking about for many, many years, and it's really exciting to see scholars taking this up seriously. And so there are many things I would love to ask you about or to pick your brain about, but unfortunately we are at time, and I'm happy to say we can direct people who found this conversation edifying to your work, and they can read. There's a lot of other good stuff, especially I would like to highlight your point about unionization. I thought was really good. So yeah, if you are interested in this topic, check out Dr. Stewart and Dr.
Falbo.
Thank you. I'm sorry. I don't have the name in front of me. So you can check out their work. Is there anything else you want to say, David or Heather, before we sign off?
No, I don't think so. Thank you both for having me in this conversation and for your work on this. I think, the more of us that are paying attention to this and trying to get these conversations going within the profession, within academia, the better. So thank you both.
All right.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks.